So quickly to add up to the short introduction. For myself, I was working with the ECB for about 4 years before I joined Jones Day in March. Since then, I have had a lot of exposure to blockchain projects due to Nick, who has been very active throughout at least 1 year or something. The ECB had also some exposure to it, but that was only, let's say, a very careful perspective on what the market is doing, like any regulatory body. But here in the law firms, the contact is much more direct, and so this will also benefit the lecture, I hope, because we can, although we obviously cannot name specific projects, but we can speak about what the market is actually thinking about, and from that you can also imagine what kind of projects are coming, or maybe you have even heard of some. Some were also in the press. So I hope that what you hear now from us will bring something that you have heard of already in a more vivid picture.
Yeah, just a few words of introduction from my end. Nick Wittek. I'm a partner at Jones Day in the Frankfurt office. I'm doing banking and finance work there for the past 15 years, mainly in the securitization and derivatives market, but also, as you can imagine, over the last 5-6 years on the regulatory front. So we tend to say everybody has become a regulatory lawyer at the moment. And for 1.5 years, as Martin mentioned, blockchain is very high up on my agenda. I'm also part of the Jones Day blockchain task force, where we exchange across regions and jurisdictions the various approaches, the legal approaches and regulatory approaches to blockchain and DLT-based technology and products. Also to see, what are the legal concepts applied in one jurisdiction, can they be used in another jurisdiction, and to also facilitate the process on a global basis, because as you can imagine, blockchain is not local. Blockchain, as we all know with Bitcoin, is global, and so is our approach. And with that, for the agenda.
Yeah, what you see here is basically what you have already seen in the program of the conference. So what we're going to do is we will quickly introduce in what ways blockchain has already impacted on capital markets and banking, or has potential to impact capital markets and banking. Then we'll explain how it works from a more technical perspective, but we're still lawyers, so don't expect it to get too technical. And then we will address governance requirements which are currently discussed, or how we assess the impact of governance rules on blockchain. So there's a lot of room for discussion. And what we will do is we will add to that discussion in the absence of final decisions, which have to come, obviously, from regulatory bodies. Yeah, and in the end, we will get through probably the most interesting aspect of it today, whether distributed ledger technology can be useful as a crisis response and make capital markets and banking more resilient, and enhance processes and make the whole system safer than it used to be, or probably currently is. But these are open questions, and we will also present them as open questions, not as definite answers. Yeah, here on this slide, we have put together the possibilities for regulated financial companies, because this is obviously our focus. The blockchain as such is, of course, not tied to regulated entities, but if regulated entities make use of it, they will have to observe certain financial regulation that applies in any case. So here on the green field, you can see potential applications. For example, you can create cryptocurrencies. The most popular application of blockchain so far, but for the financial industry, probably not the most interesting. Then you have the possibility to clear and settle securities, maybe even with delivery versus payment in an instant act, which is the most preferred solution, obviously. Then there's the possibility to exchange financial instruments. There's the possibility to enforce contracts of any type, financial contracts, and in particular collateral agreements. There's the possibility to safekeep securities on the blockchain, tokenized securities, of course. You can issue securities. You can issue coins, what we usually refer to as ICO, but it's also possible to make an IPO, so to say, on the blockchain, where you don't issue something that looks like money, but which is a real security. And then there's also a possibility for the automation of corporate actions, which is today sometimes a very complicated issue. If you own a security and the security or the security is owned through a specific chain of pledges and different contractual agreements, and then the question is who can exercise the corporate actions, and sometimes the custodian does it or nobody does it. All of these problems can probably be resolved on the blockchain with the technical innovation and creativity of the people using this technology. Yeah, and then on the right side, in the blue square, we have listed the regulated companies which could make use of all the things that you see in the green field. Yeah, governance, how are all these initiatives governed? Our key message here is it's governed by the laws and regulations that apply in any case. So if I decide to trade financial instruments on the blockchain, I cannot expect that MiFID doesn't apply to what I'm doing. And this is valid for any type of financial activity that I undertake on the blockchain. For example, if I issue a security, I have to work with a prospectus directive. If I issue a virtual currency and I link that virtual currency to a fiat currency, then it could be that I'm operating under the Payment Services Directive. If I decide to exchange collateral to secure derivatives contracts, I may be subject to the European Markets Infrastructure Regulation, and it may also well be that if I trade securities on a network, that I'm a security settlement system, which would trigger the application of the CSD regulation. So the scope of what can happen to my blockchain activity is as large as to any other financial activity. What may come on top of these rules are specific requirements addressing the technology. So what regulators, in particular ESMA, but I'm sure also many others, are actually investigating and considering is whether blockchain technology needs to be specifically addressed through a legal framework that makes the whole technology safer. But that would require that the blockchain technology reveals risks that we haven't addressed so far in other financial regulation, and that has, to my knowledge, not yet happened. So specifically on the European level, there's no real draft law that is currently under discussion, which specifically addresses distributed ledger technology. And on national level, we do have, of course, regulators who have looked into IT security and cyber security, but not only from the blockchain perspective, but from a general perspective. And as you know, financial markets are already digitalized, so this is nothing new, so to say. And one of the key messages of the people who have invented blockchain and who promote blockchain projects is that it's safer than other technologies. So this may all lead to a situation where no supplementary rules will finally come, but it's not decided, and we are also not competent to finally assess what the risks are in here, and probably it will reveal sometime later, or it will prove to be very secure, but this is something we cannot finally determine as of now.
Yeah, and with that, you know, we would like to take a step back, because all regulation and what is applicable to blockchain, I think, needs to be, or is more easily assessed when you understand what blockchain is actually about. And I guess the ultimate response here is it's nothing you need to be afraid of, and it's simply a technology. It is, and I would like to compare it to usually a computer operating system where you have MS-DOS or where you have iOS when you have an Apple, and blockchain is nothing else but a system that is operated by DLT, a so-called distributed ledger technology. It's an operating system, and blockchain operates as a database. So you need to imagine that to be a database. And there are various operating systems in the blockchain world. So there is not only one blockchain or one distributed ledger technology, but the most common types are Cordoba, R3, Hyperledger, and Ethereum. So all of these names are different operating systems. They're all using the concept of distributed ledger technology, but they're slightly different in how they are set up and configured. So similar to MS-DOS or iOS, and some of these products that you will find operate on Cordoba, for example. Other financial products or ideas are operating on Hyperledger. The most common system is Ethereum, because it's a system that is easily accessible for anybody who can download the software on his computer, and it also provides kind of a building block where you can, you know, try and make certain applications as a test or pilot program. And the building blocks make it quite easy, you know, like Lego building blocks where you can put simple programs together. So these are the systems, and what is the difference between a common database and a distributed ledger database? That's on the left-hand side. So in a common world, as we used to know it, there you have a central point with one entity who is collecting and controlling all the data. And in a distributed ledger world, the database is copied on every computer that is part of that network. So you duplicate the database, and because of that duplication, it means that if one person changes something that is not reflected in all the other copies, it's a pretty easy proof that something has gone wrong on that one piece. And that's the reason why people think it's more secure, because you do not have that one entity who could manipulate the data. You have everybody keeping a copy and following any change in the database.
Yeah, no single point of attack in regulatory language.
So what is the different, or the second step and second element that you need to understand about blockchain, and that is the blocks. What are the blocks? And we start from the left-hand side here. So the blocks are transactions that people would like to do. For example, transfer money from A to B. And every participant in a blockchain can send that transaction into the network, and then all participants in the network need to approve that transaction. And I think you need to imagine the blockchain similar to a registry of land, where every transaction, every change of ownership in the land is recorded, and so is in the blockchain every change of ownership recorded. For example, Bitcoin, they produce a certain number of Bitcoins, and then every transfer from that original number of Bitcoins is recorded in that chain. So once you buy a Bitcoin from one person, you can technically trace the ownership all the way to the root. And because of that trace, you can prove that that person who is now transferring you that Bitcoin actually owns the Bitcoin, because he has received it through a number of transactions that can be verified. And how can they be verified? And that is, I think, key to understand why the blockchain is a blockchain. Every block has two things here on the bottom. They're called hash. And the hash is a code of, 54 numbers. what happens is when you type in your transaction here in this field, with every letter that you type, the hash changes. So once you're done, you have a final hash, your number, and the following block carries that very number also as part of his block. And it creates its own hash here. And because of that link, what happens if subsequently you change the entry into this field, that hash will change, but that hash will not. So you will see if somebody's retrospectively altered the contents of one of the blocks, and it will thereby break the chain because it will not be carried through the hashes. And that's what makes blockchain so reliable, because nobody can break the chain without people noticing. So once you have sent your transaction into the chain and everybody has approved it because of the root of title kind of concept, this block will then add it to the chain and will carry the hash of the previous block, thereby giving you a consistent chain of transactions which leads all the way back to the origin. So there's another element of blockchain that is important to understand when you then later on discuss, how do you use it. And we have a distinction here between what we initially called the centralized system, the database that everybody knows is on one piece of a computer, and we have what we looked at before, the distributed model, where the copy of the database is on basically the computer of each participant. And in the usual, or in the most commonly known types of blockchain like Bitcoin, this is a distributed ledger technology that is open, so everybody can participate who downloads the software from the internet. Everybody, whether the original founders of Bitcoin want it or not, can become a participant of Bitcoin. Whereas there's also a middle thing which we call permissioned blockchain that only allows certain members who qualify or who would I like to permit to participate in my blockchain to be part of it. So I think this is important to understand that no blockchain is the same. They're all different depending on how they are set up. And another element of configuration is whether everybody in the chain needs to consent to a transaction, or whether we kind of come up with a system that only a certain percentage, a majority, a supermajority, or certain participants need to consent to a single transaction. So not every blockchain is the same. Another point which is often discussed and which is important to understand is what are smart contracts, because they are linked to blockchain technology. Smart contracts raise a lot of legal questions, like what's the applicable law, how do you transfer title, how do you change things that are once on the blockchain but do not reflect what's reality, and how do you qualify these things which are on the token. Before we look into that, I put up on the screen here what a smart contract looks like. Everybody talks about smart contract, but this is what you would actually see. It's a number of code and computer language items. How does it work? Typically, parties agree on a certain transaction or certain agreement, and part of that agreement is then translated into code. So what you and I agree outside of the blockchain is then turned into that little piece of Scrabble and computer language, and the actual contents of that code is a simple if-then instruction. So if a certain payment date occurs, then a certain amount of interest is paid from A to B, for example. It's nothing but a simple instruction that you also use already in your computer languages today. but the contract is also linked to outside experience conditions. So, for example, it automatically then concludes if a certain payment date arises that the payment is executed. So actually it's nothing particular, but why do people then everybody gets excited about smart contracts? And I think the reason is that you need to imagine the if-then instruction in the smart contract now in the context of the blockchain. In the context of the immutable block being on the chain. So it means you have an if-then instruction that cannot be altered and that cannot be influenced. So once it's on the chain, it automatically executes the if-then instruction. And there is no interference. And that is different to an old database, right? You have one person who has complete control over the data on the database. They can technically interfere with the execution of that instruction. And with the blockchain, there is no possibility of interference. And the effect is that people have a very high degree of certainty that what they have agreed and what's been put into the code is executed if and how the conditions are met and as agreed. And a lot of times, you know, as a lawyer, we deal with situations where people think, oh, will he really pay? Or will the securities really be delivered? Really adhere to the obligations that he has? And that's exactly the point. You have a high degree of execution of the agreed terms of the contract. But, and that's what we put down on the slide on the bottom here, legally speaking, this is not a contract, but it's the partial automated execution of a contract agreed between two people. When you, let's say in the common language and in the language used with all the IT people and the Bitcoin people, they all think of smart contracts as being contracts, but you know, from a legal perspective, it's execution of something that people agree bilaterally. I just wanted to highlight a few legal aspects on smart contracts because ultimately the talk is about governance. But I thought it would be relevant to at least point you to a few questions that typically arise when you talk about smart contracts. So one of the questions is usually what's the applicable law? You have simply a piece of code in the world. You know, there's no one source who actually put it there. People have the question, so what's actually the applicable law? The applicable law to the executed agreement, the applicable law to the transaction, the applicable law to the system as such, because it may be spread around the world. Copies of the database are in various jurisdictions. You have questions of liability. You know, who's actually responsible for it? What happens if the data is wrong? What happens if it's not executed? What happens if somebody's not compliant? Who's actually your point of contact where you can go to and say, you know, you're liable for what damage has been done to me? So often what we tend to do is we tend to solve that issue by using terms and conditions for the use of that blockchain. You know, the same way that when you go to your online banking portal, you click the box, or when you go to Amazon, you tick the box, and these are the terms of use for that particular program. So there are ways to address these concerns, but there's also often a situation where nobody cares about these terms of use. Obviously, you know, we have issues. Can you transfer an asset on the blockchain? What happens if there's cross-border elements? You know, does the jurisdiction across the border recognize the transfer that we may agree in Germany for German assets? And you have the matrix problem. The matrix problem is, I don't know whether you're familiar with the movie Matrix. So in the movie, you're either in the matrix or you're outside the matrix. And that's the same issue with blockchain. Once you are on blockchain, everything that is on blockchain is kind of a closed circle. So you need to rely that this is what's on the blockchain is true. But what happens if reality outside of the blockchain differs to what's on the blockchain? How can you correct that? And given that it's an impeccable system, you know, this raises the question, how do you undo a transaction? You can't erase it, but you probably would need to do a counter transaction, yeah? Or you need to introduce something like an override for a regulator or a court, for example, to enforce transactions. And these questions come up, you know, when there's termination, errors, rescission, what have you. I think that's a matter of how you configure your chain. And then you have, on cryptocurrency, mainly the issues that come up on how do you qualify what you have on your blockchain. You know, is it a security, is it a financial instrument? And with it, all the regulatory implications, what we are discussing here. You know, do you need to comply with the prospectus directive? Do you have rules of conduct? Do you have money laundering provisions, etc.?
Okay. From the regulatory side, most prominently, the ESMA had issued a report which was preceded by a set of questions which were addressed to market participants to get a better picture to what extent regulatory measures would be necessary and whether there's really a governance gap in the blockchain. This has been really an open question, and for ESMA, the most crucial point is obviously to keep securities markets safe and to maintain integrity of any kind of securities trading that is happening in the Union. And so what ESMA is actually doing in this report, it raises all the benefits or most of the benefits that could happen when you apply blockchains, and it also lays out the concerns that obviously arise when blockchain technology or any new kind of technology or trading is coming up. This is obviously based on the experience that financial innovation has sometimes surprised regulators, and this should obviously not happen again. So this investigation that the ESMA has been undertaking here is actually following the purpose of not being surprised by something that comes out of a black box. The most obvious concerns are obviously that any computer system can be hacked. You have all heard in the news that wallets with cryptocurrencies were hacked and huge amounts were stolen. We have also seen in our practice cases where people are asking, how can I get my money back? And they have then said, okay, we have information that the hacker operated from Germany. What can we do about it? These are all issues that are getting to people's minds when they speak about this technology. Although, when financial institutions or market participants create something to undertake business with, they will do it in a way that somehow excludes most people who could enter such system with criminal intent. And this is what Nick was referring to earlier, this permission-based blockchains where you make a clear set of criteria who can actually enter the blockchain, and then you have already your source of identification, and you can run all know your customer checks and maybe even look at capital requirements and many things. So if you establish some kind of closed system, these things are very unlikely to happen. And most of the scandals that we hear of related with blockchain or Bitcoin are actually coming from virtual currencies which are fluctuating around the globe and where anybody can somehow participate, and systems and banks or companies who provide these wallets are basically open to the whole market because they are acting with an open system. And what we are more thinking about here is how can actually systems designed for specific purposes with a closed circle of people who can participate.
One thing to add maybe to this case was the interesting point is that everything that went wrong outside of the blockchain. So in that case, the coin was delivered, but the money wasn't there. And why wasn't the money there? Because the money wasn't transferred on the blockchain, but the money was transferred or not transferred outside of the blockchain. Why? Because it's difficult to get money onto the blockchain, so they delivered the coin, but the money had to go the regular way, and they stopped the money outside the person who was supposed to pay, so they had influence. If it was all on the blockchain and you had the immediate delivery versus payment, that wouldn't have happened. So I thought that was an interesting aspect, because it's not a failure of blockchain, but it's a failure not to have everything within the matrix, but part of it out, one leg inside the blockchain and one leg outside of the blockchain. And the second interesting thing is also that when you talk about money laundering, blockchain or DLT is not anonymous. Yeah, people are pseudonyms. They have numbers. So technically, it may even be easier to identify the people who are acting on the blockchain, because they all have a number. They all have a key. It may be difficult to identify the person behind the key, but it's less anonymous than, for example, cash. Cash, no names, nothing. But here we always have a number.
Yeah, exactly. And now, governance issues have two layers. One layer is what regulatory framework applies. The second layer is how do you actually govern your blockchain project. And the first aspect of it is, of course, who do you let into it? So you can run a permission-based closed network, or you can run a permissionless network where everybody can participate. For financial business models, it may make more sense to have, at least for the time to come, a permission-based system, which means you can easily comply with all identification and data protection and capital and MiFID regulations, because you actually know who is participating in your system. This can then extend to rules to approve or reject the participants. If you come up with a certain project, you can establish these rules. And then what is very crucial for any type of network is how you govern the interactions between participants. If you have a system which is probably based on smart contracts where you have people exchanging financial collateral on the blockchain, you need to have rules what happens if there are some disturbances in this exchange, or if the result that is produced by the blockchain is not the intended result from the contracting parties, because as we heard, the blockchain or the smart contract is not actually the contract, it's rather the executioner of the contract, which is unstoppable in a certain way. So once you've pulled the trigger, so to say, this contract is executed, and any information that enters the blockchain will have immediate effect. And this effect, which is outside the blockchain, usually subject to discussion or even litigation, and various aspects come into play, this is all not happening on the blockchain. It's immediately done, so to say. So the collateral is changing the owner, or some transaction is executed, some loan facility is paid out or not paid out, and this has very immediate consequences. And for these types of things, you need to have a framework that regulates any kind of default that happens in there. Another crucial aspect is also the remuneration model. If you run a system, you will have to have some idea how you charge your services, and how you reward other service providers and so forth, and what participants have to pay if they act on it. And finally, the framework should not leave too many open questions, but should be clear also to supervisors when you undertake a regulated activity like trading financial instruments. Then it must be very clear who is responsible if something violates, for example, MiFID provisions, or who customers can turn to if they feel that they have a claim or a tort claim or any kind of claim for unsatisfactory delivery of services.
Yeah, so just to add one example, yeah, there are already market participants looking at how do you exchange collateral. So they are using that database or the blockchain technology to see how can we actually improve the way we transact, we exchange securities to make that more liquid, to make it more immediate. And there you need a governing framework around that, for example, to also say, you know, what is the effect that I put towards that blockchain? What do I think does that mean when there is an interaction between two parties? And what does it mean when the token changes from A to B? And there is room for legal interpretation in the sense that you can assign a certain meaning to that happening on the blockchain. And it may be different under English law that they say if the token changes, we change equitable title from A to B, compared to German law where we may say, you know, if you change the token from A to B, it may mean that the custodian will mediate the possession not for A but for B because that's the person to whom the token now belongs. So that neutral technology may be given certain meaning from a legal perspective, and that is important to determine in the beginning and to set out in these rules so that everybody knows what is actually the meaning of the transactions happening on the ledger. So a few things, and that's I think also a key point when you talk about tokens and ICOs and DLT. You know, this is only a neutral technology, and I was actually 2 days ago. I was at the ISTA conference in Miami, and I arrived there a bit early, so I had the pleasure or and a bit of time to go to the Everglades. And at the Everglades there was a tower where you could walk up and you could take a fabulous view. And I wanted to enter the tower, and the lady said, yes, you need to put in a dollar note in order to go through the gate. And so I put in my dollar note, and what I got was that little token, which I had to put into the gate so that the gate would open. But the funny thing was, when it came out of the machine, it said token on it. And I thought, okay, this is funny. You know? You put in a dollar bill, and what you get is a token. That is really blockchain. And I thought that was important to note, because the English term token is very neutral. It's simply a placeholder. So when you look at it from a legal perspective, it's not the token as such, but it's important what's in the token. And we've set out what the BaFin approach is here. They follow that substance approach. They look at what is the contents of the token. What does it give the holder of that token? Is it, on the bottom of the slide, is it an equity? Is it kind of a security? What are the rights that are granted with this token? Are they similar to an equity? Or is it more in line with the currency? Or does it only give you the right to use a certain rebate system or to enter certain or to participate in a certain system of rebates in buying shops or whatever? So you need to look at the contents of the token, and depending on what the contents is, and there you kind of look at the left-hand side, you know, that's also then relevant of what is the governing rules for that token. If it is giving you similar rights as in a fund unit, then you may end up to be an AIF with your token issuance. Or if it gives you rights which are very similar to an equity, then, you know, we're looking at the prospectus directive, because that will be applicable to securities. It could also be, you know, that it's an asset investment, and under German law there is kind of a catch-all clause that anything that is not a fund and that is not a security and that is not a financial instrument could still be some type of investment that is regulated under the investment laws. So the contents of the token determines of what are the governing rules for that particular blockchain application. And similarly, on the right-hand side, you know, if you are falling with any of these categories, you may also be subject to regulation and governing rules, be it that you're issuing tokens and you're not only issuing them, but you're dealing with them for others, or you know, that you end up to be a fund, then you are under the AIFMD directive, or it may be that it's a type of a payment service that you're offering. You know. So BaFin has given, I think, a great example on taking a more closer look at the Bitcoin. And Bitcoin, when it came out, you know, they looked at it and said it's a virtual currency. So what's actually its contents? It's not money, but it's used similar to money. It's a peer-to-peer network. Yeah. So there is not only one person you can go to turn your token back into money, like it is with e-money, but there is multiple people. So that's why they said if there's not one person, but there's multiple people, it cannot qualify as e-money. So they were left with, okay, what do we do? And the ultimate decision was then made, it's operating similar to a unit of account. It's used like quasi-money, and as a unit of account, we can qualify it as a financial instrument. So they went through the substance analysis and came out with a financial instrument at the end. And that gave them the right to say if it's a financial instrument and you know, you're trading with it, then you're obviously falling within the MiFID regulation if you, for example, buying and selling it for others. Yeah. And on that basis, they came to the conclusion that certain activities that are linked to the Bitcoin may qualify as a regulated activity. Yeah. You may also be a multilateral trading facility if you're bringing people together to trade Bitcoins, or you may be operating similar to an exchange where you act as a market maker by offering to turn Bitcoins into euro back and forth to create liquidity for the market. So the key message here is the contents drives also the governance of the token.
Yeah, so far so good. Now in the third part of the presentation, we have put together all the aspects from the ESMA report that were considered as positive and that which describes the positive impact that blockchain technology could have on financial markets. So the fact that this report brings up all these issues and of course also mentions the downside, but I would say that also from reading the report, the impression that you get, or at least that I got, is more optimistic on the issue. Yeah, it's still something that we have to discuss, but it shapes the way a bit, and from what we have seen, all the enthusiasm in the industry could actually change financial markets in various aspects, and these we have laid out now in the following slides, starting with DLT as a means to speed up clearing and settlement for financial transactions by reducing the number of intermediaries and making reconciliation processes more efficient. So what are the financial intermediaries which are actually threatened by this technology? Most of all, the CCPs who facilitate derivatives transactions by securing both trades and providing money for each party that is becoming victim of the failure of the other party. So how is this actually be done? If you execute a derivatives trade on the blockchain with an automated exchange of collateral, the central counterparty is not necessary anymore because the collateral is directly enforced if something happens, if some default happens on the other side. And any exchange of money, let's say under a normal interest swap, so to say, will only happen if at the same time necessary collateral is posed under regulatory requirements, as we have, for example, in EMIR. The settlement also is no problem anymore, specifically the settlement period, which is still sometimes very long, which brings often frustration in financial markets, especially if you're the one who's waiting for your security that you bought to be settled. And this can also be reduced, this settlement period can be reduced significantly because on the blockchain it would happen within minutes that a securities trade is settled. And if you are not dependent on a central securities depository or any other depository, but if you are actually settling the trade with finality, in the words of the Settlement Finality Directive, then there's nothing more that you need to worry about, and you reduce your risk significantly because you're not depending on various parties to function properly. So, reduced counterparty risk and probably also less need to post collateral because the time that you need to survive, so to say, is significantly shorter than it currently is. Yeah, recording of ownership and safekeeping securities, the typical custodian business, central securities depositories, custodians. You have probably heard or familiar with the system how securities safekeeping works. It's a multi-layer system where on top you have the central securities depository, and then lower down you have custodians and sub-custodians sometimes, and it can be a quite complicated system. All of it may become superfluous if you bring this on a blockchain where you have only one piece of code which you transfer almost instantaneously without any further need to record it at another entity or even make a deposit of a physical asset or anything like it. So if we get to a point where a security can be fully reflected on the blockchain, and I think it's safe to say that we have reached that point, you could probably avoid the very complicated and sometimes very unstable system of securities depositing, which is subject to many regulatory initiatives, AIFMD or UCITS directive, CSD directive, and so forth, national laws. It may all become superfluous if this system works properly.
Yeah, I think to add to that, there are ideas how to do that. And when you said, who will be falling away, it may also be the intermediary custodians, which you don't need. I think there's a number of jurisdictions, for example, like Luxembourg, that permit already the dematerialized issuance of securities. And going back to my initial statement, blockchain is a technology. It doesn't really matter whether you use as a system to issue your dematerialized security, the current system, or you use DLT. Yeah, but DLT may come with a number of advantages. So I think this can actually happen faster than people think it may. The issue to overcome here is that you need to have sufficient participants to be on that system. So they all need to come into the matrix, because once it's on the blockchain, everything will happen on the blockchain. And then there's always the issue, okay, how quickly do I get my security out of the blockchain if I need to? Or how many market participants do I have in order to trade with?
Yeah, the very interesting question, I think, is also who will push these projects in the market? Will it be those who are already undertaking the business and then in order, let's say, to save themselves, will now switch to the other system and establish it under their own name, or will it be very new companies which simply take up the challenge of fighting those who are now established? So this is totally open. I think the whole industry is now looking into these projects, or at least every big bank, let's say, for European standards, those supervised under the SSM or direct ECB supervision. I think most of them are considering it, have some projects, or are considering to bring projects. And these can take very different shape and forms, but I think will be oriented at the business models that these firms currently run. And I'm very confident that we will see a lot more projects going public, because for the banks, of course, it stays confidential for the time it's not fully elaborated, but as soon as it is, these banks will also use it for promotion and for advertising, and to bring the message to the market that they can cope with a new technology and are actually up to date. Yeah, recording of ownership, automated processing of corporate actions, reduced ambiguity of contract terms. I mean, this is a twofold knife, so to say. If my executioner, the smart contracts, enforces everything instantaneously, and in the end I'm not happy with it, then I don't know whether it will always be possible to say, luckily we have reduced ambiguity, because it's actually our profession to work with that ambiguity in one way or another. But I'm confident that we will also survive blockchain.
Definitely.
So with all these threat that it brings, but frankly speaking, I think it will shuffle up the market, and many players will have to reconsider whether what they're doing now will also be requested by the market in the future. Okay, next point. DLT could facilitate collection, consolidation, and sharing of data for reporting, risk management, and other supervisory purposes. So it can even be interesting for supervisory authorities to manage their data, to require valid data from the market. I mean, you may have probably heard that data quality and transparency is one of the big issues. The Basel Committee of Banking Supervisors, they were issuing a very prominent paper on risk data aggregation. All these things could probably also be enhanced through a blockchain technology where I have a very direct and instantaneous system of providing information on my risk management, on my reporting issues, and also other supervisory purpose. I mean, supervision really actually depends on information and on actual and meaningful information. And if we can enhance the way this information is provided, then maybe also the system of supervision could probably benefit from the blockchain.
Maybe I want to just give you an example, which covers all three of these things. That's also public and in the press. So there's a system or provider thinking about how to help facilitate and collateral. So, and the specific example is that a lot of banks are now required to hold liquid collateral for LCR purposes, for liquidity cover ratio purposes. And if you think about blockchain, if you had a system where the securities are instantaneously tradable, you can quickly exchange your non-liquid or securities that are not qualifying for a liquidity cover ratio with securities that are qualifying. So it would help people in the market to basically outbalance their liquidity ratios more easily. If somebody has too much high liquid assets, they can exchange that high liquid asset against non-high liquid assets and give it to somebody who needs it to actually fulfill their liquidity cover ratio. And if you have a non-settlement risk immediate transfer, you could do that exchange without enduring counterparty or settlement risk at that. And at the same time, a lot of these permission blockchains would also permit the regulator to have a look into that system, which it depends on how you configure it and how you set it up, but it would obviously add to the transparency that in real time, all market participants, the ones who exchange liquid collateral against non-liquid collateral, would look at the same data as a golden source, and the regulator would have also a view of what's happening. And it would be immediate, so it would help facilitate that exchange process. And this is a live example, so there is an entity out there who's offering that service. And then you look at it from a legal perspective, how does that have to be set up? What do the terms need to say in order to enable the parties to exchange that collateral? And one important point, I think, and that's a keyword you should also be familiar with, is oracles. Yeah? And that plays a role here too, because oracles are the element between the matrix and the outside world. So whenever outside world information comes into the blockchain, somebody needs to verify it or needs to provide it in the right format. And these third-party providers are called oracles because they have their tentacles with all the real-world information. So with that system of exchanging of collateral, for example, you would need somebody to verify that the collateral that is exchanged from one person to the other on the blockchain is actually available or is available in a custody account that you can then later on, for example, retrieve it from. So you would need to have a trusted third party in an oracle function to help you build that system. So these are all things which are not necessarily legal, but where you need to have a think about how you set up your system so that it fulfills the market requirements and would at the same time be helpful, for example, to stabilize capital markets and help add transparency for the regulator.
Yeah, what on this slide I think we've already discussed it. If settlement of securities is done instantaneously, the need to post a lot of collateral or secure the settlement process as we do today for very good reasons might not be necessary, threatening the business of central counterparties. Next point, while we often address cybercrime, hacking, and so forth, the blockchain as such is perceived to be more secure than ordinary information technology systems. And if that proves to be true, the strongest concerns that supervisors actually have may be mitigated. For this to be achieved, it will take some time, but if it finally happens, it would have a very significant impact on the resilience of financial markets, and it could also maybe to a certain extent reduce the need for recovery or resolution plans, because every transaction that you undertake is happening a lot quicker with instantaneous effect. So what you're actually, and this information, if it is on a blockchain, will always be available from any point. So to make a centralized concept of a recovery or resolution plan where you gather information from various sources, if you have a complex financial group, for example, the exercise to collect that information is substantial, and this exercise could be seriously facilitated if you have a system which brings all this information together in one point. I think this is it. This was the lecture. Here we've put together a few key messages. I hope we mentioned everything so far so that this really appears as something that makes sense to you right now.
Is there any question?